On this episode number 2, we're going to discuss personal accountability as a police officer and how that relates to training. Going after the bad guy is not the interest of every police officer.
Young patrol officers that were just out looking to get into anything that we could.
Where mistakes can be made, and in this line of work could be devastating.
If that's something that we're going to say, make sure you're going home at the end of your shift. You have to back that up with something.
118, tell this my family alone. I can't copy. 118, tell my family alone. We got crews coming.
So on the last episode number 1, we talked about the inception of kinetic concepts. I did leave a short story out of that I think is important, so I'm going to go ahead and tell that now. And this story is about being intentional. So if you are somebody who you believe you are an intentional type of person, then this is for you. So we often hear people say, mean what you say and say what you mean, right? And by saying that, we pretty much mean if you say you're going to do something, follow through with it, right? If you are that type of person, you can reach out to somebody, maybe it's your friends, your coworkers, or on social media, and you could just put it out there, whatever it is, that thing that you think you're going to do, that you want to follow through with. So maybe it's start a business, maybe it's work out more, maybe it's lose some weight, right? By you telling these people that you're going to do this thing, if you are that person, then you're holding yourself accountable to what you said that you were going to do. And we often see, people on social media, maybe Facebook or whatever the case, maybe they say, I'm going to start doing this, or I've been working out for this long, and then you check in a week later, and now they're no longer doing that thing anymore, right? To me, that's kind of embarrassing a little bit. So one of the things that I was doing before we kind of started up Kinetic Concepts, of course, talked to my wife about it, made sure everything was cool there, and that was good. But I literally wrote out a text message to these guys over here, and I typed it out, and I think the text said, I'm going to start a training company. And I typed it out, and I walked around my house, and I looked at it. And as I was looking at it, I was deciding, whether or not I wanted to send this text, because I knew that when I sent it, there was no turning back, right? So I did send that text message, and then I realized at that point there was no turning back, and I needed to follow through. So if you are somebody that needs some motivation to do something, maybe go on social media, put it out there, tell people you're going to do it, and then one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to turn out to be the person that you say you are, or you're going to find out who you really are in the process. So this conversation here today is about accountability, and these conversations that we're having today, in the future, and through all the training that we're giving out and the information that we are giving out, is so that officers don't fall victim to the things that we had to figure out for ourselves, right? Because we were all there once, we all made mistakes, and we had to kind of learn everything on our own, right? There wasn't somebody out there that was putting out similar information and trial by error kind of thing, right? So when we talk about accountability, I'm mainly talking about accountability to police officers that are being proactive, right? And so when we're being proactive, we're out there, we're looking for things to get into. And usually when we're out there looking for things to get into, we get into things, and then, certain things happen, and that raises the liability factor for these officers. And so this conversation is more geared towards those types of officers, right? I think that there's this misconception with maybe some people that aren't police officers, or maybe officers that aren't on a large department, right? So before I became an officer, I had this preconceived notion of what I thought a police officer was. And then where I got to where I am today, and I realized literally anybody is a cop, right? And different personalities, etc. And so what that comes with, different personalities, is different interests, right? And I don't think most people know this, that some police officers don't become cops necessarily for the reasons that we think they do, right? And the reasons that we became police officers may be vastly different from the reasons other people become police officers, right? So tactics, training, shooting, going after the bad guy is not the interest of every police officer, right? And so that's important, because we of course encourage and agree that officers need to be held to a high standard in training and within marksmanship and all of those things. But if we hired every single person that was into the things that we're into, we wouldn't probably have officers that were available to go do other investigations, like homicide investigations maybe, or crimes against children. And I can tell you that we need those officers, and they're doing a job that I definitely don't want to be doing, right? And they do a really good job at that job in particular, right? So officers become police officers for many different reasons. Some of those reasons may not align with some of the ideas that people think that they become police officers for. And therefore, what you get is officers with different interests. And when they have different interests, it's almost like, I want to say like a hobby, so to speak, right? You know, we have a good time and we enjoy doing the things that we do. Other officers, that's not their job description, that's not in their title. And so it doesn't really necessarily require them to be held to that same standard.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think the stereotypical answer for people whenever they do their entrance interview as to why you want to be a cop is it's like always like, oh, I want to help people. And I think that's legitimate. I think that is, for the most part, why a lot of people get into law enforcement in general, is to help people. But then I noticed in myself over time, I started to find that I had a skill set and a passion for going and getting into things and finding the bad guy. And so I think from there, you're able to, like I said, hold that. I understood that I was going to get myself into situations that were probably going to be more dangerous, involve more liability. And so from there, you start to try to train more. You start to try to learn things from other officers who are out there that are more experienced than you, and hopefully something that you can kind of retain and start to build upon for yourself.
Right. And so I had my first experiences with cops that were really good at things other than tactics and shooting. And that's when I kind of realized that, oh, we need these people, you know? And if you have a large department in a large metropolitan area, the standard is what the standard is in terms of, you know, tactics and training, the baseline standard. And if we tried to implement some marksmanship standard that was, I would just say, extremely difficult, then we would have much fewer officers on the street, much fewer officers to fill those spots that we needed filled. And so I think that's kind of how we get to where we are today in terms of the standard that is in place for, let's just say, marksmanship wise, and how much time does it actually take to get to the level that most people think cops should be at, right? In terms of marksmanship, how long does it take for them to get there? How much time, not only time, but logistics-wise, money-wise, does it take to actually get there? Not just get there, but also maintain that, right? And be able to replicate it. And so while we agree that the standard should be high, I think that's a contributing factor to why it isn't necessarily as high as most people think it should be, because we need cops on the streets to fill positions that people like us don't want any part of.
And as far as the progression professionally within law enforcement, I think there's this misconception that you can just jump into whatever like cool job that you want to do. Like, oh, hey, I want to go do crime scenes, or I want to go do, you know, SWAT or stuff like that. And that's not the case at all. Like, especially within our department, I think this is across the board within the United States, is you get onto the department and your first assignment is you're going to work patrol. And I think everybody is supposed to, from that, develop skill sets that are going to eventually help them to professionally develop into the career that they want to do. For us, it was proactive investigations, which then you develop your tactics and things like that. And then, you know, you progress through the department that way. But for other people, it is, you know, like, I'm going to do the best report that I can do and try to do some sort of like preliminary investigation. And then that's the career choice that they choose.
Right. I think it's fair to say that the same officer who is really good at investigating financial crimes is not the same guy that wants to do the job that we're doing or has any interest really in putting in the effort to, you know, maybe be where we're at or at least obtain a similar skill set.
It's like the other guys. Will Ferrell didn't want to go kick doors. You know, he was happy to do permit investigations.
Right. So you talked about different jobs, and that's something that they ask you in the academy, right? I think they ask, who has an interest in this? And people raise their hand. Who has an interest in that? And that's what you see that not everybody is interested in going after the bad guy to not necessarily be involved in a confrontation, although that's what comes with it, right? They have other goals and other ideas that don't necessarily align with that same level of accountability, so to speak, as somebody who is out there every single day, making that decision to dedicate their career to that style of policing. So whether it's being a patrol officer or being working your way up to be on a TAC team or even to go beyond that, right? Now, I don't want to take away either from the what you mentioned, which is every cop starts there, right? And so you could very well find yourself in a position, whether you want to be there or not, in that time span before you get to move on and make that other decision. So this conversation is also for those people, but what we see is, and my primary concern is for the officers that are out there putting in the work, that are maybe doing surveillance, they're getting into these confrontations, they're getting into police chases, they're putting themselves out there, and you talked about the different reasons why, because they want to help people, but, let's not ignore the fact that it's a fun, right? Like, let's acknowledge the fact that we enjoy it because it's a good time. I think that's fair, right?
Adrenaline junkies.
Yes. So, and being involved in these, situations, fills that thing for you. It allows you to do that. And gain, like you said, also like gain the experiences that you need to go on to different aspects of that same style of policing, but maybe in a different way. So I've heard the saying, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right, in policing. And I think over the past several years, at least 5 years, I would say maybe, there has been that kind of attitude or, maybe sense of like behavior amongst, just maybe it's just a phrase that people say. But in my opinion, I feel like that phrase doesn't promote necessarily the good aspects of policing that we like to see in officers, right? And I also need to say that we are not encouraging officers to do anything, right? You're your own person. You make your own decisions, and hopefully you make good decisions. And that's not our job is doing. That's not what this is. We're not, talking about this to encourage you to go out there and do it. But we know that cops are going to, right? And so, what do you think about that idea with, essentially saying, even if I do the right thing, I'm going to get, in trouble, or it's not going to work out in my favor?
I mean, I don't know. We've talked about before, and I think as far as the accountability aspect goes, every time that I've seen discipline come down, there is some sort of factor that led for them to get into that position, if that makes sense. Like, I've never seen someone get in trouble that was 100% innocent, did everything perfect, right? Which I think is also in and of itself a difficult thing to attain, because there's just so much procedure policy-wise that you always have to kind of navigate as you're doing things, and it's oftentimes that's not what's in your mind whenever there's a bad guy doing whatever he's doing in front of you. So I think it's trying to balance that, right? Like, understanding that you're accountable and making sure that you're trying to do everything the right way as best as possible, but also accepting the fact that sometimes something's going to happen and you just got to live with it and move forward.
Right. And, so that leads into culpability, which I'll get into here in a second. But essentially there's rules, right? And you can go and read the rules. They're right there for you. And they tell you what you can and you can't do. And, that's your policy, the state, state law, local law, all the information is there. And as long as you're following within those, guidelines, then there's not a whole lot that can be done to you, right? In a just way, I should say. And someone had always told us, what was that he said?
Make a mistake of the mind, not of the heart.
Right.
I think is that what you were getting at?
No.
Okay.
Righteous, right? As long as you're righteous in what you're doing, I have your back, right? And that's that's it, right? It's, well, understanding all the things I just said, but also, do the right thing because you know it's the right decision, right thing to do. And so working within those guidelines, it doesn't leave a lot of space for anything negative, to happen to you in terms of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't kind of mentality, right? In the situations that I know of, in the vast majority of them, if an officer was in trouble for something or something came down or was highlighted, there was always, almost always, some culpability on the officer's part. I'm not saying that I agreed with it. I'm not saying that it made any sense. But at the end of the day, there was some responsibility and accountability on that officer's part. And so I don't want to ignore that either, right? And say everybody's good all the time, no matter what. Like, you have to make good decisions. You have to understand why you're making those decisions, and you have to be able to articulate why you're making those decisions. We also hear people say, and this is something that I was exposed to as a younger officer, and I'm sure everyone has heard this, where they say, the most important thing is going home at the end of your shift. And when I heard that, it made a lot of sense. And then I realized that the people that were saying that weren't people that were actually either A, kind of putting in the work, and B, definitely didn't train at all to make sure that that was going to happen, right? So if that's something that we're going to say, make sure you're going home at the end of your shift, you have to back that up with something. That statement makes sense. So that leads into training, right? Because that's what this is. We're talking about accountability. How does training relate to being accountable? Jake, you got anything?
Like, instead of the more training, if you train, scenario-based training and whatnot, you have an idea of what you can do to accomplish, to, solve a problem out there. And that goes, into accountability, but you can go off that.
So I think the ultimate goal as far as training is to, I don't know if inoculate is the right word, but to
expose.
Yeah, to put yourself in situations to where you see how you respond, what your responses are, if they're appropriate, and if they're to your standards that you find acceptable. And then from that, you hopefully are able to either tailor it or adjust it to where you're getting the results that you want. And for us, I know a lot of times when we're doing our training is we try to, when we're doing scenario-based stuff, try and formulate it to be as applicable as possible to the student that we have, because we want this to be something that is going to translate to a real-world experience to them later on down the line. And so I think when you can do that and you can continue to repeat that and you get the results that you want, like, that's the ultimate goal is to be able to then, once this situation does happen in real life, it's not that you're on autopilot, but you've been there before, you have a process and you execute it, and then you perform at the standards that you've accepted for yourself.
Right. And I think ultimately what you're doing, and I think it takes you, if you're just starting out or you don't have a lot of experience training, you will learn this later on as you start to build your skill level and as you start to see the skills that you're acquiring in training replicate in real life. Then you start to realize that actually what you're doing is building a foundation of understanding what you're capable of accomplishing in a training situation, and then relating that to the actual real life situation. And most cops don't train, right? They don't either get it through their agency or they just don't put themselves out there to get it. Maybe it's a logistical issue, time, money, etc., whatever the case may be. And I'm saying this from experience because my first couple years on patrol, I didn't really, I shot, a little bit, but I didn't really, seek out a whole lot of training. And I'm guilty of that, right? And I look back on it and still to myself, I think in my mind, yeah, you're capable of that in that situation. But really at the time, I was basing that off of what? Like, what am I basing that off of?
Like what you did in the academy whenever you know, you get 2 full weeks of a block of training where it's just like that is the only thing that you're doing is firearms training, and then how often do you from that point go and follow up with it?
Yeah, and I think that most cops, and this is just what we see from body cameras, is that they expose themselves in real life versus exposing themselves in training.
In training environment.
And if you show up to training, like my suggestion is you just volunteer, you just go first, and you just keep doing that, and it becomes, you know, we talked about in the first episode, habituation, deliberate habituation. You become, you know, comfortable in a sense, right? You're still feeling the same feeling, but you're operating on a different level.
But there is value in the on-the-job experience. You're putting yourself in positions where something were to happen, and at the end of the day, you know, it worked out. The bad guy was placed into custody, and as long as if you're not seeking the off-the-job training, and say you are in an area that you're being exposed to a lot of things, as long as you're being honest, and if you have a partner or if you're solo, after whatever happened, and you actually analyze what you could have done to be better for if it were to happen again, there is value in that. So, yeah, I mean, we've, like you were saying earlier, you know, when we were first on, we didn't get, you know, we didn't do a lot of outside training or whatnot, but we're being exposed to a lot of different situations on a constant basis, day to day. And there was a lot of value and a lot of experience gained from that, because after each experience, we analyzed it. Hey, we could have done this better. Next time, do this and this and this. And there's value in that. But that puts yourself in a position where mistakes can be made, and in this line of work could be devastating. And seeking the training outside before it even happens, that's the goal. And that's what you have to understand.
And because I think, like you said, training can only replicate so much.
Right.
And there's so many things that you do in law enforcement that you really get no training in. And, you know, I'd say, for example, police pursuits. You go through the academy and you learn how to drive, and you maybe chase a car around a track, but you don't get any training on police pursuits afterwards. You know, is it necessary? I don't know. I'm not here to, you know, argue that. That's just an example. You pull up at a location and you're going to go talk to somebody, and he starts running and he jumps over a fence. Like, that training doesn't exist. Doesn't exist yet. But there's a lot of things that you're going to get exposed to in the job that you're not going to get training in, but that will allow you to tailor your training as well, right?
Right. And we're saying that with on-the-job experience, as long as you're not just going through something and after it's done, you don't analyze it at all. You don't have a hot wash with your buddies or whatnot, and come up with ways that could be better. The downside to that is if you go through those experiences and you don't critique it and you just go on with your day, it's going to come up again, and you're going to make the same mistakes, if not worse mistakes. So that's the big difference there with on-the-job experiences and training, so to speak, is having that maturity and accountability of actually critiquing and hot washing what happened, what could have been better, what could have done to solve the problem better, instead of ignoring it. Oh, it worked out, he's in custody, nobody got hurt, nobody got in trouble, okay, and just move on and not learn anything from it.
I think that's one of the biggest issues, that terminology where people say, it worked out.
Yeah.
And that is a common pitfall. And those conversations that you have amongst your group, with your partner, they're sometimes tough conversations to have. And like you said, you have to have a lot of maturity. And, you know, I like to, once you start building that relationship with that person or that team, you start to figure out, different characters and how people react to different things. And we've all kind of at times left a conversation maybe, not as well as we would have liked to, didn't get crazy or anything, but just in terms of emotions, right? And we've always come back at the end of the day, ultimately to figure it out, right?
If I could give any advice to an officer that's younger, that's like really proactive and is wanting to get to that next step of going to attack unit or, trying out for part-time or whatever, it would be to be able to take criticism, right? Because you see it a lot, like a lot of these, and I mean, I was the same guy, is you get out there and you start kind of going through things, you start getting your experiences, you start getting your car chase, your foot chases, all that stuff, and you kind of build this in your head, your own ideology of who you are, and then you go into like a tactical realm and you realize that like it doesn't transfer. Some of the stuff does transfer, but a lot of it is completely new information. And so I think it's important to have that understanding of you don't know everything, and just to kind of just try to come in and be a sponge. We talk about stuff as far as like hot washing, and just I feel like that we have certain people in environments like that do not take criticism very well. And as a result, the only person that they hinder is themselves, because ultimately, like, it's not a personal attack. I'm not here to try and be like, Fred, you suck. But like, if you do something that's messed up, it's like a family, and it's like cliche or whatever. But in reality, like, I spend more time with people on my team than I do with my own family. And the goal is for us to all be as safe as possible and to accomplish whatever goal it is that we have set up. And if you aren't able to take that criticism in the moment of making a mistake and having somebody point it out and try and correct it, then you're really of no use.
I would also say that there is a way to give constructive professional criticism.
Yes.
And that's what we do in our courses when students come and have really no base, most of the time, no baseline understanding really of what we're teaching. And that is something that I think is unique, and I assume most companies are doing it that way, because you get a different type of training when you go to like your agency and you go to train. They kind of talk to you or treat people in a certain way maybe that isn't, like, if you owned your own company, you wouldn't do that, right? And what I've learned, it's like you have to, make these students or these officers comfortable, right? I don't believe that in these training scenarios and when we're teaching that it's of any benefit to, project yourself in a certain way that makes the student uncomfortable with the training, because they're not going to listen to anything that you have to say, right? If they don't like you per se, then they're not going to, like, it doesn't matter what you tell them. They're going to have that thought in their head, like, this guy's a jerk, I'm not going to listen to him. And so there is a way to give criticism in a professional way, right? Which I think is lacking mostly, but if you're on a team or with your partner or whatever, I assume that that's what's happening, right? Because like you said, it's not an attack, a personal attack. The reason that you're doing these hot washes, these critiques, or these after actions is to learn what went well and what didn't go so well, and how you can get better, faster, quicker, more efficient at meeting the objective of whatever it is you were trying to do, right? I think at the end of the day, that's pretty much the goal, right? Mm-hmm. How can we do what we did, maybe faster if faster is necessary, but more efficiently and safer, right? So if you want to be the best officer that you can be, you're obligated to hold yourself accountable, because one of the reasons for joining law enforcement that for me was you're on your own, in my opinion. You get in your car, you go do your thing, you have certain tasks that you're supposed to be completing, but generally speaking, there isn't somebody sitting next to you telling you what to do all the time or making sure where you're at, what you're doing, right? You're making your own decisions. And a lot of the time, you're by yourself. So, you're accountable, right? And this means, like we talked about in the critiques, not only giving constructive professional criticism to each other, but also being honest with yourself and understanding what it is that you're capable of accomplishing. And that's where the training aspect comes in, right? Like we talked about, it allows you to become more understanding of what you're capable under certain conditions in certain situations, because what we see most often than not, officers on the street are trying to do things that they are not capable of achieving, right? And that is kind of an issue, right? And the reason is because they don't have any baseline understanding for what they're able to accomplish under certain similar conditions that are closely more replicated to the real thing, right? So if you're being proactive every single day and you're only shooting when your department requires you to call, then you're lying to yourself, right? If you are interacting with the person and you know you're about to have to put handcuffs on this person, detain this person who is maybe a suspect, and you don't take that time to ask for another unit before you start doing this when that option is available to you, right? And you have time is on your side because you're like, I can handle this guy, you're lying to yourself. It's not a good decision. Does it work out? Usually, but not always. Like we see videos and cops are struggling with somebody by themselves. Nobody knows where they're at yet. They haven't called for another unit, and now we're in real trouble, right? And so, there has been situations where, in videos that we've seen where all the indications were there that you would think would afford you the time and the opportunity to get the assets that you needed in place to take care of the problem more effectively and more efficiently and do it safer. And instead, other decisions were made that didn't need to be made, and now all of a sudden you're in a fight for your life for really almost no reason. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a tactical decision, right? Anytime you're moving around or you're making decisions that don't require necessarily marksmanship at the moment, these are all tactical decisions that we're making, right? And part of being a solo cop, part of the fun in being a solo cop by yourself is understanding that you're by yourself and making decisions based off of that information. And so I also think that part of the problem is in law enforcement, we have an issue with telling officers, that professional constructive criticism, right? We continue to tell officers, good job, or you did a good job, when it seemingly wasn't a good job, right? And I think all these other things that we're talking about may be a little bit more difficult to accomplish. More training. Okay, well, we need more money. We need more time. Where are we going to do it at? Like all these things, right? And that's something that we're trying to address, obviously. But I think we could at least start having the right conversations about what's actually happening, right? And I know that most people, I'm not really necessarily speaking about people online or so to speak, but even there, and I understand that these people that are viewing these videos don't have any understanding, right? And they see something and they kind of comment or they share it like, hey, they did a great job. And they're probably just people on the internet, like they don't understand. But it's like, literally none of that was good, And then you slow the video down, you highlight some things, and all of a sudden you see like the guy is 8 feet away and we're dropping rounds 4 feet short of the guy, And, we know that in some situations that we've been exposed to, that conversation isn't happening with officers in a professional, constructive way where they are not going to continue to go out there and perpetuate that what they did was good. And I think if we start at least having that conversation, you can at least start to change the dynamics of what's happening maybe a little bit, right? And that's like the easiest thing to do is say, hey guys, we're going to stop showing up and telling them that they did great when we obviously know this isn't something we train. This isn't something they were ever taught to do. And maybe rounds were going places they didn't need to go. So we're not going to say good job, right? So what can we say? Hey man, you good? Yeah, I'm good. Okay. All right, we're glad you're okay, right? Just leave it at that. We don't have the conversation about what happened, but then after action, round table aspect of it, we can start having those conversations and start getting the officers to understand, kind of the things that we're talking about in terms of what their capabilities are, right? And I think that aspect of policing is always going to be the individual officer's responsibility, no matter what. And if my kids decided they wanted to be police officers one day, I'm just straight up going to tell them, you're on your own. No, don't expect anybody to provide anything for you. Don't expect, the training to be top notch. Don't expect to get a lot of it. You are going to, reap what you sow, And I believe that, accountability being the whole topic of this conversation, that good or bad, regardless of what the outcome is, you are not only culpable, but you have to hold yourself accountable as well. So I think a lot of times, we hear this. It's kind of like that conversation piece where people say, the most important thing is going home at the end of your shift, right? That's something that people say. And then people also say, they also blame the agency for their failures. And I just think that is the complete wrong thing to do because of the reasons that we mentioned, the logistical aspects of it, time, money, all that stuff. It's like, I don't think any of us in this room are waiting for the government to do anything for us, right? And so the bigger the body of government becomes, the harder it becomes to make things happen. And so when people are blaming agencies for their shortcomings or the lack of this or lack of that, it's an excuse.
Nobody cares.
It's an excuse, and you're right, nobody cares. If you end up in some trouble because you did something you shouldn't have done, or you were kind of doing the right thing, but there's still a lot of culpability, nobody cares. And so you have to literally, do as much training as you possibly can if you want to increase your accountability and at the same time limit your liability, right? So where they say the most important thing is going home. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously very important, but is it not equally as important to not end up in, jail, right? I mean, that's pretty much not going home. Those two things kind of run together.
Or someone else doesn't go home because of a decision that you made that was an improper one. We start dumping rounds and we hit somebody innocent in the background. Like, was that the most important thing today is that I went home? Probably not.
No.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. And that is, I've heard that too. I've heard in situations, and a common one I can think of is when, and I can't, it's hard to repeat the things that you've heard because it just doesn't make any sense to you at all, is, if cops shoot, or we've discussed tactical, operations, and we've discussed ways to minimize, having to shoot into vehicles and all the things that you need to account for when you're shooting into that. If you decide to pull the trigger, on somebody who's in a vehicle, like, do you know exactly where that person is? Can you see them? Like, are you sure that your round's going to go where you're intending it to? Are there other people in the car? Is this a police chase, or is this, how did you get here? Have you been watching the vehicle? Do you know for sure there's nobody else in the car? Because we've been in situations where children should not have been present and they were, right? And that's one of those things that I've heard officers say is, we've mentioned that, like, well, there could be people in the car don't need to be shot, and they're say, well, that's their fault. They made that decision.
Shouldn't have been there.
Yeah, it's like, well, that's a problem that you're going to have to deal with, right? And that leads back to the culpability and the accountability, right? That's not going to work. That's my assumption anyways, that's not going to work. That excuse is not going to work out in your favor. That's not how I perceive it. Now, in one of those situations that we're familiar with is in LA, where there was a guy inside of a Burlington coat factory. He was assaulting people with a bike lock, very brutal. The dude was like really hurting people. Like, there was a lot of blood. It almost looked like an active shooter when these cops were going in there. And they press forward and they get to where they think the bad guy is. And they see the guy down the aisle who I don't believe was really in the immediate vicinity of anybody that he could assault with the bike lock. And the officer shot 3 rounds, I believe, with a rifle. And I think one of the rounds hit the guy, and the other round went through the dressing room wall and hit a 14-year-old girl.
I think it was a skip, wasn't it?
And killed her. Well, that's what they are saying, or that's what I read. It skipped off, which is something that you can't. you can't necessarily control, right? Maybe, but also if your rounds are hitting flesh and meat, there's a very low probability that your round is going to skip off, right? And so, getting into the marksmanship side of that or aspect of that decision-making process, what's going on right now? Who's in absolutely immediate danger that this needs to happen? I'm deciding to fire. Why am I shooting 3 rounds as fast as I can at this guy who's 20 feet away with a bike lock? Now, I'm not getting into legal things or anything like that and whether or not the guy needed to, be put down. That's neither here nor there. All I'm saying is the decisions that you made that day, and it appeared based on movement, based on equipment, and decision making that there wasn't probably a lot of training involved, right? And that's also, LAPD though does do a great job of that training aspect. They are the best in, I think, the nation of training patrol officers. I believe they do it once a week, and one week out of every month is what I heard, and it shows in what they're able to do. But my opinion is just that you can't afford for that to be something that happens. And again, if you're that proactive officer that's out there putting yourself out there in these situations, you decide to pull the trigger, you decide to shoot a lot, or you're not hitting what you're intending to hit, that's on you, right? You're all you have, and nobody is going to, if you make a decision that jeopardizes the safety of the public, very few people are going to even be able to come forward on your behalf and say, I agree with this decision that was made, right? It becomes very problematic and very hard to do that. And so when you're out there and you're doing all this training, you need to understand what you're doing. You're building a foundation and determining what you're capable of accomplishing. And you'll learn that really quick in terms of when we put officers in these situations, we don't see the performance. We see them at a very basic level of performance, and we see where they're at, and we know where they can be, right? And I think they see that too, right? Because obviously they show up, and you put them in the situation, and they go, "Oh, that didn't go like I thought." And it's like, this is the whole idea, right? This is the whole point, is that you put yourself here, and there's something to be said about that too. The officers that show up, they pay money to come to these classes, right? And so not only are they willing to put themselves in these situations that are going into it, there's some, you're going to be amped up a little bit. Like there's going to be some emotion. You're going to get some of that physiological response to stress. And you're already, by signing up for that class, you're already saying, I'm willing to accept this, right? And the more that you do that, the more comfortable you become with it, which is kind of a word that you should be careful with, I think. Comfortable. But as you said in episode number 1, you become comfortable and familiar with putting yourself out there, being part of the process, and at a certain point, the things that you're doing, you want to be thinking about less constantly. The more you train, the more you develop a process for things, the less you have to think about, and the more you can focus on what you actually need to be focusing on. And a lot of times, the thing that they should be focusing on is marksmanship, and marksmanship isn't necessarily being applied under a wide variety of situations out there on the streets.
I had a story, but I think I'll save it.
What is this a story about? Accountability, culpability?
Well, just understanding what you're capable of. So Jake and I were, proactive officers in the day, and we've been partners for the entirety of our careers. Just, I think, a little bit unusual as far as what you hear from other people. But this was in the early days of when we were been pretty good little hot spot for us finding drugs and guns. So walk over to a vehicle. The positioning wasn't great, and you learn from experience, tactics and stuff. The positioning of our vehicle, we were facing the opposite direction of the way that the suspect vehicle was facing. We go start to make contact. There's several reasons for us to be able to get into this vehicle. So we're going ahead and asking the guy to get out of the vehicle. He refuses to do so. And at that point in time, throws the car in drive and accelerates rapidly away. So we run back to our vehicle, already a little bit behind the curve. And I had seen those cool J turns, demoed before. Like, seems very simple, and just accelerate really fast in a straight line backwards, and then crank the wheel as hard as you can while throwing it, until you come back to center, basically 180, and then throw it in drive and go. So that seemed, reasonable enough. I'd seen it done before. Surely my skill set would allow me to do this. So I do the first part of that, throw it in reverse, accelerate rapidly, and clip the front end of a car that was parked on the side of the street behind me and terminate chase, because we were by ourselves, and you hit a car, it's game over. So we made it like 30 yards into this.
Did you complete the turn?
No, I made it, I would say, like not even 45 degrees.
You probably did that once in training, right? Like
J-turns? Never.
Never?
No, they would show it to us, and they're like, here's this cool demo. Now don't ever do this ever again. And I tried to do it. It didn't work out. So that was, for me, a chance to understand my limitations. And Jake would argue that my limitations are reverse in general. That's been where I've had a majority of my problems in driving. But yeah, just a little example of knowing what you're capable of.
Let's go over a list of some things that we can give as suggestions or advice to, I just say, newer officers or whoever wants the information, we'll put it that way, on things that they can do without any training at all, that if you just listen to what we're telling you to do and you stop doing that thing, you will increase your accountability, limit your liability, and you will be safer in doing so, right?
Okay.
So one of those things is it's not a normal traffic stop. The person that you are dealing with is wanted for a felony, or either has a warrant for a felony, or they demonstrated that they could potentially have a weapon in the vehicle. It rises to the occasion, stolen vehicle, of a felony offense. Okay, I think there's nobody in the country that should be teaching. The first thing that you should do is walk up to the vehicle and just try to handle it by yourself.
Negative.
Now, that's, for whatever reason, is still happening, which I have no idea how that is even possible, right? But let's think about it for a second. Time, distance, numbers, right? We have a post on the website. Can't remember the name of it, the actual title of that post, but we talk about time, distance, and numbers on that blog post.
Yeah.
And, again, especially if you're by yourself, but even if you're not, right, we want to get as many assets to us as possible before we do anything at all, before we can essentially, hopefully, cause a reaction from the vehicle, right? Because when we have assets in place, we can slow down, we can start to take our time, make different decisions, get the equipment that we need, and then start to handle this problem in the way that you were trained to probably handle it to begin with. And, another example is you approach a suspicious vehicle on the call, and you approach and you see a guy in the vehicle with a gun on his lap. I've seen this a number of times. And I'm not telling you to do this or this violates your policy or whatever, but if the vehicle isn't contained, that's kind of the number one thing first, right? He's not, conscious, he's breathing, obviously he's asleep and passed out, whatever. But, think about containing the vehicle, right? As long as that falls within your policy. And when I say contain the vehicle, I mean literally leave it nowhere to go. Not block the car in from 10 feet away where he can just smash your car and then drive off. Again, defer to your policies. But it doesn't do us a whole lot of good if we alert him to our presence and then he drives away. That's going to cause other problems, vehicle pursuits, endanger the public, right? So that's an option for you. And then again, we've observed this person in this vehicle, we've contained the vehicle. Now what should we be doing?
Maintaining distance.
Maintaining distance, getting as much cover as possible, putting as much of our
Getting as
vehicle,
much resource.
if our vehicle is the only thing that we have, putting much of our vehicle between us and the bad guy. And then once we have these things in place and everybody's ready, hey, you guys good? Yeah, we're good. All right, lights and sirens. This is whatever police department, exit the vehicle with nothing in your hands, and then you work it like a felony, like you should, like you were trained to. Because what we see in those situations, cops standing right at the door, the window, and knocking on it, alerting him to he's there, and now you're there, and now he has a gun, and then it just becomes extremely problematic. I'm not talking about, justifications or anything like that. I know there was a recent one, I forget where it was, that I had put up on somewhere, one of the social media sites. And, that's what ended up happening. They alerted him. They were at the vehicle. He did whatever he did, and he started driving off. They shot at him, and then the officer got, I think indicted or something, right? So let's not do that. Let's just avoid that situation. Some other advice that I would give is, as a newer officer, to slow down. That's something I learned the hard way. And I'm talking about literally slow down. In your vehicle, why are you going there? They always say, if you can't get there, you're no help, right? And that is true. Clear intersections, slow down. It's not serious enough for you to get smashed by a car in the intersection. And then, potentially, which happens a lot, innocent people get killed, right? That's a major problem. I guarantee you, if that happens to you, you're not going to say, yeah, it was worth it, I'd do it again. No, you'll be like, I would have slowed down. Mm-hmm. And luckily for me, I was able to, I was involved in a situation and there was an accident. It was very minor, but that's when I learned I need to slow down. It's not that serious to where if something happens to my car, because like you said, if we get into a vehicle accident, minor or not, you got to stop. Like, that's it. You can't go anywhere. Now you got to make notifications. They got to come and investigate that. So slow down. I think that's a major problem just in general. There's graveyards of police cars, destroyed. And so do you have anything else as far as major tactical things that they could easily just make the adjustment and be better and safer for it?
Well, I'd say one thing that would help out if it, especially the type of officer that would actually listen to this, and that's seeking advice and training, especially in a patrol aspect. If you're on a scene where, say it's a car chase and it ends like the vehicle, drives off the road, or what we say, it cracks up, the suspect's still in the vehicle, and all of a sudden you have like 15 other patrol officers that are on the scene, and everybody's pointing their weapons and yelling different things. Be the guy or the girl that steps back off the gun and just assesses the situation and starts maneuvering and making calls that calms the situation. That not everybody needs their weapon out. We need to get less lethal options out there. We need to move guys that are out in the open to cover, get them, time, distance, cover, all that good stuff. Like, be that person that you don't need to be on the gun. It's actually better for at least somebody or multiple people to step off and maneuver people and get resources that are needed to the scene, get on the radio and all that, because that's a problem I see a lot in patrol. Everybody's like their own supervisor and whatnot. They're not on a team. So when it comes down to a situation where you actually have a team of patrol officers, somebody needs to be the leader. And that's advice I'd give. Like, be that person. Hey, I don't need to be on the gun and giving verbals. And when you're doing that, everybody else is doing all sorts of things. Step back and assess what's going on and make the adjustments necessary.
Mine kind of piggybacks off of what Jake said. I agree 1,000% with that. I wish, as a patrol officer, that we would have had a little bit more exposure to a team environment where you could see like how that works. But my thing would be just to have a plan. Like, while a situation is actively unfolding, is not the time to come up and try to, like, there's situations where something changes and you have to change your plan. But just in general, have a plan. Slow down for a second, create a plan, and know like what your job function is. And you can do that, with your partner in the car on the way to a call. Hey, this is a domestic, potentially armed suspect. Okay, cool. Hey, if we get there and first thing we're gonna do is the guy still here? Okay, if he's still here, okay, now we need to go ahead and posture up, find a good place to try and establish this scene and start locking things down. So I feel like a lot of times when you're watching body cams and stuff, it seems like the officers, the first time that they've thought about what am I going to do is when they're in that moment, and it's already too late. You're already behind the curve.
Well, what you said there, by having a plan, you're reducing the amount of things that you have to think about, right? If we have a plan, we kind of have a foundation for what we're trying to achieve. And so if we come up with a plan, I expect you to follow through with that plan and to be where you say you're going to be. And then I don't have to worry about that part of it. And then what Jake's talking about is, or what he's talking about is the difference between wanting to be the guy and willing to be the guy, which is some of the conversations that we have in some of our classes. You know, I think it's really important that if you're out there and you're doing these things, be calculated about the things that you're doing and understand the difference between wanting to be the guy and willing to be the guy. When you're willing to be the guy, you're just going to fall in wherever you fit in, wherever that makes tactical sense for you to do that. And then the decision making is going to be better too. Because when you want to be the guy, you're going to start to make different decisions to put yourself in a position that you think is better for you based on something that doesn't necessarily have to do with tactics. And that's going to, you know, cause issues. That's going to cause tactics to maybe not unfold in the way in which they should. And then being able to be involved in the moment. And we have a number of officers here that are already pointing their guns at this guy. And you're saying, someone needs to take a step back and see the bigger picture, right? That takes a lot of maturity because officers generally want to be the guy, right? And when I see, you know, I kind of look at it like, you know, when I played high school sports, you know, say basketball, for example, I was never somebody that could really score a whole lot. You know, maybe I scored a couple baskets a game, but I understood that that wasn't really my job, you know, because I was a point guard. So my job was to coordinate and, you know, evaluate the team, make adjustments, call the plays, do all these other things so that we could be successful, right? And the victory for me, the fulfillment for me was always when the team did well, you know, and it was like, I didn't have to score to feel the same feeling as the person who's hitting the shots. You know, I made a nice pass, you know, to somebody that scored, and I thought that was the best, you know, and because I understood that, well, one, like it's cool, and I, you know, did something that people liked, but also because of what I was doing, we were able to facilitate, you know, the win or, you know, the score or whatever the case may be. So I see that as a good, you know, comparison, so to speak. And if you are wanting to be the guy and you want these things to happen for you, right, whatever those things are, if you make that adjustment from wanting to willing, I believe that that thing that you want is going to naturally happen. And it's going to make sense when it happens, and it's going to feel right when it happens. You guys got anything else?
I think we're good.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Kinetic Concepts podcast, episode number 2. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you find us on Instagram, Kinetic Concepts _group, or on YouTube, Kinetic Concepts _group. And we'll see you on the next one.
We got crews coming.